I want to thank everybody at Cal Maritime for the invite coming out here. It's a pleasure, metaphorically, to be out there. I am at my home in North Carolina, so I hope to get out to Vallejo sometime in the near future. So with that, what I'd like to do today is talk about strategic sea lift and the U.S. Merchant Marine. This is a talk I've given a few times now, and one of the reasons I enjoy giving this talk is because I like having the opportunity to especially educate people on the different areas of sea lift and how it rolls into our overall national defense strategy, but also what the U.S. Merchant Marine looks like today. Right now, we find ourselves really on a precipice of the U.S. Merchant Marine. Where's it going? What's the future going to hold for it? And I'll come back to that at the end and really want to link that together. So what I want to talk about today with you is the four elements or the four sides of a pyramid that are built on our national defense strategy in terms of the U.S. Merchant Marine. And those four elements are fleet support. This is the direct support to the U.S. Navy, the Afloat Prepositioning program, which are really the merchant ships that are on the cusp of the razor's edge out there. They would be the first ones to go into areas to offload. The Strategic Sealift Fleet, which is made up of vessels from the Department of Transportation's Ready Reserve Force and the Military Sealift Command. And then finally, Sustainment, which is made up of ships of the Maritime Security Program, the Jones Act, and basically the commercial U.S. Merchant Marine. So I'm going to talk about each of those four in a little bit of detail, talk about a little bit of their history, where they're at today, where they're going, and also make sure I want to leave enough time here at the end. I'll go to about 1:45, so that if you guys have questions and guys and girls, sorry, have questions, I'm more than willing to field them, and hopefully I'll have answers for them. So one of the things I would recommend, and again, being the historian that I've become, I always got to recommend things. So in this month's proceedings, the United States Naval Institute proceedings, is this article from Nicholas Lambert. What is a Navy for? Strategic purpose is not the same thing as operational necessities. I would make this required reading of everybody out there. I think Nick Lambert's piece here is absolutely magnificent. He puts into context what a lot of people talk about in terms of Navy, sea power, merchant power, you name it. And he goes right back to talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan, which everyone loves to quote, but no one wants to read. And what he says is basically that the whole reason for the U.S. Navy in the 1890s and going forward was to protect the Merchant Marine. It's commercial. It's not military. This is what made the British great. It wasn't that they had a big Navy. It's that their big Navy was protecting their commercial interests. And that was an element that's absolutely essential there. This piece, again, in this month's Naval Institute proceedings, it's great. It's part of their American Sea Power series. It's great. Every month they're coming out with that. So if you have an opportunity to go read this, I really strongly recommend it. I think it will make you think a little bit different about the relationship between the Navy and the Merchant Marine. I've seen lots of comments coming from naval personnel about that, which I think is great. Myself, I do a lot of writing myself, and one of the things I write about are really two elements here I write about. The first one, the piece on the left there, was in what's called Sea History magazine. It's the National Maritime Historical Society. That was on the 100th anniversary of the Jones Act. That's available for looking at through their site, seahistory.org. It's a piece that talks about the Jones Act, what the Jones Act entails. A lot of people write about the Jones Act, talk about the Jones Act. There's a vocal lobby against the Jones Act out there. One of the things I will tell you that's misjudged about the Jones Act and not known is that the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 was really this nation's first maritime strategy. It does not just involve coastal cabotage shipping. It was in the intent to build up on what Mahan started in 1890 and talk about what we should have as a national merchant marine. Again, the cabotage issues in Section 27, there are 31 other sections in that act, and all of them dealt with different issues that were essential to understanding that. The other article I have there is one I wrote for Proceedings. This is in their CNO's Naval History contest for 2019. And this one, I basically posed the argument, what if there was a war and the Merchant Marine didn't show up, or we didn't have a Merchant Marine? And what does that mean for us going forward? We've been able to sustain ourselves militarily with a Merchant Marine in every conflict we fought. The problem is, will we be able to do that going forward in the 21st century? What are the limitations of our current Merchant Marine? What's our current limitations in terms of vessels, mariners, infrastructure going forward? And this essay, which as I said, got recognized by the CNOs, which I found very amazing they did, because it didn't deal with Navy issues directly, was able to get a little bit of attention, which I'm happy for. So let's go into the topic at hand here, which is those 4 elements. Those 4 elements are built on 4 different sources of vessels. Basically, the U.S. sources vessels from 4 different areas. One is the Military Sealift Command, which is the commercial vessels operated by the U.S. Navy, and I'll talk a little bit more about them and their role here in a second. They're the vessels of the Ready Reserve Force. These are the vessels that are maintained by the Maritime Administration. They're a subset of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. And they're the ones that are used in time of war. We would activate in several days' notice, get into the seaports of embarkation, and sail across the oceans to potential areas. We've seen that exercised in the Persian Gulf War of 1990, the Iraq War of 2003, and in a myriad of other exercises going on in operations throughout its history. And then on the right is the U.S. Merchant Marine. A subset of the U.S. Merchant Marine is what's called the Maritime Security Program. These are 60 vessels that receive a direct compensation from the U.S. government, about $5 million per ship per year, to be U.S. flagged and operate on the international trade routes. And the key for those vessels in particularly is they don't just provide shipping, they don't provide just tonnage and TEUs and square footage, but they provide us networks and logistics hubs and trade in the different areas. So we get into the Maersk system, we get into Hauppauge system, we get into APL, which is CMA. We get into all those kind of chains. And then finally, there's the U.S. ocean-going merchant fleet. These are the vessels over 1,000 gross tons engaged in coastal and ocean travel. As of 15 March, there are 180 ships that qualify in that area. And I'm going to go in depth in each of these and talk a little bit about each of them in a little bit more detail here and let you know what each of these do and some of the issues and highlights that we should be aware of. So first, there's the Military Sealift Command fleet. Roughly about 110 vessels commanded by a 2-star admiral, rear admiral, based in Norfolk, Virginia. This fleet is larger than any numbered fleet out there. This is more vessels, more tonnage than any other of the numbered fleets out there. It's also a subpart of the U.S. Navy. One of the things that I know you're aware of, but not everyone is aware of it, but 1 out of 5 vessels in the U.S. Navy, out of the 300 so vessels listed in the battle force, 1 out of 5 have civilian mariners on board. And unlike contractors, these are not contractors. Some of them are directly employed by the U.S. government. Some are contract operated mariners. In other words, they come through companies that are contracted to the U.S. government. They are controlling assets that are in the direct unified chain of command. You don't see contractors commanding squadrons in the Air Force. You don't see contractors commanding battalions in the Army. You don't see contractors commanding, units in the Marine Corps. Yet within the U.S. Navy, you do have civilian mariners who are in that unified chain of command. That makes them very unique in terms of their authority. About 60 vessels. Half of them are in what's called fleet support. Those are those vessels in red right there. They provide the direct fleet support, which I'll talk about here in a second. And then there are others in kind of a secondary role, which I shouldn't say secondary. That's not a true statement there. But in a kind of a support and combat services role out there. So vessels like sonar surveillance vessels, which operate the SIRTAS system to monitor Chinese submarines. They would be right on the front lines in case of a conflict. The expeditionary fast transport ships that Todd commanded, fleet tugs, salvage vessels, all of those are in that level. And we see them out there. So I want to talk first about this fleet support, these 29 vessels on the left here that provide the direct fleet support to the U.S. Navy. This imagery came out on the internet today. This is a satellite photo, commercial satellite photo in the South China Sea, showing a Arleigh Burke class destroyer and a Henry J. Kaiser class oiler, probably the Pecos or the John Erickson, I'm not sure which one it is, out there being shadowed by a Chinese frigate. And this is the role that merchant mariners play. Merchant mariners man the 15 vessels, the 15 Kaiser class oilers, the 12 Lewis and Clark class supply vessels, the 2 supply class fast combat logistics ships. And they're out there. They provide the immediate support to the U.S. Navy. And what do I mean by immediate support? They're the ones that do the underway replenishment. They come alongside Navy vessels, or Navy vessels come alongside them to be exact, and they provide replenishment, fuel, ammunition, food, toilet paper, you name it. Everything in the world is in these vessels. This is a role that the Merchant Marine has been doing for a long time, long time. Some will sit there and say the very first underway replenishment vessel was the Teluga back in 1972 in Vietnam. So I thought for a long time, but it's incorrect. You can go all the way back to 1899 and the USS Alexander, a collier that was actually recrewed with civilian crew to bring coal to the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War. And for a long time, the U.S. operated civilian manned shipping. It was a key component. Even if you go back in the age of sail, there were civilian supply ships that supplied the squadrons in the Mediterranean fighting the Barbary pirates, for example, or down in the Caribbean. This underway replenishment job is absolutely essential. It's what gives the U.S. Navy its legs. If you want, there's a lot of issues you can make with Navy vessels today, and some issues with construction and everything, but I will hold hands up that the finest combat logistics force vessels in the world are the U.S. And the Kaiser class, which is being phased out here soon by the new Lewis class being built at NASCO in San Diego, are some of these key vessels. But there's a problem associated with this. If you go back to the concept of civilian crewing, one of the things that came out in the 1970s when this was initiated, when the USS Teluga became USNS Teluga, was the MSC vessels would provide the key element of what's called the shuttle ship. They would load cargo at forward bases and run them out to U.S. Navy manned station ships. And then those shuttle ships in turn will be supplied by merchant shipping coming out. So if you read about the U.S. Navy in World War II and you read about Service Squadron 10 or Service Squadron 8, it's great, it's fantastic. One of the things that's left out of a lot of those histories are those dozens, if not hundreds, of War Shipping Administration merchant vessels that bring food and fuel out to those forward bases. Well, in the 1970s, the decision was made, we got to reduce numbers in the Navy. We have to save money, so we'll start doing the civilian crewing. But what has happened since the Vietnam War to the modern day is we have gotten rid of shuttle ships and station ships and replaced them just with MSC vessels. So now MSC vessels have to do basically double duty. They have to sustain the fleet and then run back to forward bases, draw supplies from forward bases that unfortunately are being more and more supplied by foreign flag vessels versus US flag vessels. And one of the problems with that is, number one, you don't have enough vessels. It works great if you're in the Persian Gulf and you're sustaining out of Fujairah, or if you're in Korea and you're supplying out of Yokohama, or if you're off the coast of Vietnam and you're supplying out of Subic. It's a whole other thing if you're running against the first island chain in the Pacific and you've got to run back to Pearl Harbor, or worse, the West Coast. And now you don't have enough assets to do that. Add to it, go back to this picture right here. If I want to cripple the U.S. Navy's fighting ability here, and I'm this lonely Type 54A frigate, I'm not going to go toe-to-toe against an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. I'm going to get blown up. I'm going to die. There's no way you survive. However, the one you shoot at isn't the Burke. You shoot at the Kaiser. Kaiser is unarmed, has no defensive armament at all. And more importantly, once they're gone, so goes the underway replenishment ability for the U.S. Navy to stay forward. It's a big liability going on right now. And those merchant mariners find themselves on the front line all the time. They are integrated into the U.S. Navy battle groups, and we see them out there on the front lines all the time. So that's the fleet support element that provides 1/4 of that overall Sealift mission. The second one there is afloat prepositioning. I love this photo because this was the notional concept of afloat prepositioning back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was an issue that rose up with Iran. You had the Iranian hostage crisis. You had the flawed attempt to basically rescue the hostages. This is Desert One. And there was a realization that while we were in good position in Europe, we were in good position in Asia, we were in a poor position in the Middle East in terms of bases and supplies. And so one of the concepts that was resurrected from pre-Vietnam days was this idea of basically floating forward depots, renamed maritime prepositioning ships. And the concept was to load to the gunnels These specially built or converted vessels, the joke with maritime prepositioning ships is they're one half roll-on, roll-off ship, one half container ship, and one half tanker. They have a little bit of everything in them. And what you saw beginning in the 1980s was the creation of these three maritime prepositioning squadrons, one in the Atlantic, forward deployed to the Med, one in the Indian Ocean at Diego Garcia, and one in the Western Pacific based on the Marianas. And each of them could support a independent Marine brigade, roughly 16,000 Marines for 30 days. They had everything you needed but the Marines and the aircraft. So it's like, add water, an instant Marine brigade. And we saw the concept validated in 1990 in the Persian Gulf. The first units to hit the ground on, with heavy armor support wasn't the 82nd Airborne. It was the 7th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, followed by the 1st Marine Expeditionary Brigade. And over time, the Marine concept has matured and developed. Unfortunately, some of those original MPS vessels are still out there. They're referred to as legacy vessels. That's a euphemism for old. I like to call myself a legacy historian for that. The Maritime Prepositioning Squadron has been reduced from 3 squadrons down to 2. You've added vessels to them, some of these modified large medium speed ro-ros. You've added a sea basing element to these squadrons that allows them to offload at anchor in a very unique way, as I'll show you. And one of the things that we see is this is a very expensive program. One of the things about maritime prepositioning is you're paying for a vessel 24/7 every day of the year to basically sit there and be ready to go. It's an extremely expensive program for the Marine Corps. And after the Persian Gulf War of 1990, you add an Army element to it. The Army added a squadron, initially 8 large ro-ros, now it's down to 5, a couple of container ships packed to the gills with ammunition. And the Air Force, same thing, have a couple of vessels that are out there. But the Maritime Prepositioning Squadron, in conjunction with the Army, really gives you a unique capability unlike anybody else on the planet. The Army has brigade sets ashore and afloat. The Marine Corps have their brigade sets afloat and ashore. Theirs is in Norway. That's ashore. And one of the things this allows you to do is not just to land the individual brigade. So for example, in 2003, the Army, the APS-3, which is the Army Prepositioning Set 3, which is the one that's afloat, was able to offload in Kuwait. And that put a brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division ashore. Well, that unit, after it unloaded, went to Qatar and Kuwait and picked up the 5th APS and moved them into position. So you were able to move unit sets around quite quickly around the world. And again, prepositioning is a very unique concept. The problem with prepositioning today is Diego Garcia is a very controversial area, unclear whether we're going to be able to maintain the base there because of ongoing diplomatic relations. The Marianas is within DF-21 range. This is a direct fire missile range, a ballistic missile of the Chinese. And so a lot of question about the utility of these ships going forward. But they do provide a lot of sealift capability. Once they're offloaded, they go back into that common user pool. And a lot of mariners have spent their time floating around Diego Garcia and Guam doing this. Don't know where this is going in the future. They keep talking about replacing and redoing this force. There are proposals to do a big fleet expansion early in the 2000s that kind of went astray. It didn't kind of fall in. But this program right now is definitely one of the key ones out there. The other problem you have with this is the fact it has to swing through key choke points. So for example, if you have to go to Korea or Taiwan, for example, you have to swing through the Straits of Malacca. If you have to go to the Middle East, same thing. These vessels, just like the vessels that are in the fleet support role, are unarmed. They do not have any armament at all on board. And so they would have to be escorted. They would have to be convoyed. And unfortunately, the Navy finds itself in a shortage of convoy vessels. Back in October of 2018, Dave Larder for Defense News got the Navy quoted as basically saying that they don't do escorts, that basically the Navy's, that the Merchant Marine and Marriott are on their own when it comes to getting to places. And that will expose these vessels to potential risk in case of a peer-to-peer style conflict. So the prepositioning role is definitely an important one. But again, you see it changing. So for example, the image in the upper right there is of one of 2 expeditionary support docks, or ESDs. ESDs are basically modified Alaska-class tankers built by NASSCO in San Diego. They can house 3 LCACs on board, but more importantly, they are big enough that they can moor alongside one of these large prepositioning vessels. You can put the ramp down on its deck, and now you can offload that vessel using those LCACs, and you can actually do it beyond the horizon. It'll take you forever because there's a lot of tonnage on an LMSR, and LCACs are fast, but they're not that fast, and they don't carry that much cargo. So it would take you a long time to do it. The other element you have down here is these new expeditionary support bases, what's called the Puller class expeditionary support bases. They're a derivative of the ESDs. These look just like the ships like the John Glenn and the Montford Point, but instead they have a large helideck on board. They can house special operations crews on board. They can launch small boats, drones, you name it. Really, it's basically a mobile floating base out in the middle of the ocean. And they're building at least 5 of them right now out of NASSCO. They're under a very unique crewing arrangement. They're actually commanded by a Navy 06, but they have merchant mariner crews on board. This is what's referred to as hybrid manning. The deck, engine, stewards are all merchant mariners, but the command is under a U.S. Navy captain, an 06. Creates a very unique dynamic on board and also raises potential legal issues down the road should those vessels ever find themselves in combat. So that's the second element of that pyramid. The third one is this. This is the Surge Sealift fleet. Surge Sealift falls under 2 entities. This is the Maritime Administration with the Ready Reserve Force and the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command with their Strategic Sealift Forces. So quick little bit of history here. As Will mentioned, I wrote a book on sealift in the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, we were right at the cusp of the fleet, the U.S. merchant fleet, going out of date. It was 1965. The U.S. merchant fleet had been built in the 40s. We're coming up on the 20-year, basically, life expectancy of the vessels. And there was a big issue about rebuilding the U.S. merchant fleet. U.S. shipyards were untouched thanks to World War II, whereas the rest of the world's shipyards had been leveled as a result of World War II. Our prefabrication yards, the yards that built ships like the Liberty, in which were all around the San Francisco Bay Area there, went away because the prefab yards were not the traditional yards. They went away. And we kind of went back to the old style of building vessels, whereas the rest of the world embraced prefabrication. And we were really at the cusp of this big technological change. Well, in rolls the Vietnam War in 1965, and the decision to go deploy American forces in large numbers. We already had forces in Vietnam since the 50s. But then there's the Lyndon Johnson call to put the first air cav into the A Shaw Valley. We got to send Mel Gibson off there, so we got to get them from Fort Benning to Vietnam. That's the shortest scene in the movie. They leave out that one little part of getting from Georgia to Vietnam. But to do that, you have to call on the vessels of the U.S. Merchant Marine to do that. You had to call on vessels of the Military Sealift Command, but you also had to call on vessels of the U.S. Merchant Marine. And what's interesting is in 1965, there's a strike going on the East Coast vessels. The East Coast U.S. merchant ships were on strike over what they go on strike about all the time, money and hours. But because of the emergency in Vietnam, they agreed to put that aside, load cargo, and get the Army and the Marines and everybody else over to Vietnam. But the problem was Vietnam was not on the normal shipping paths. Not only was it not on the normal shipping paths, but even when companies added them to the normal shipping paths, they had to make special arrangements because the ports were so slow in Vietnam that you were sitting there days, if not weeks, waiting to offload. And shipping companies aren't going to do that. We just saw what happens when shipping companies go astray with schedules with the Suez. And so the U.S. needed ships to fill those commercial vessels, and it tapped into what was then the National Defense Reserve Fleet. The ships left over from the World War II building program under the Maritime Commission were put in anchorages throughout the United States, 8 large anchorages, one of them right there in Suisun Bay in California. And basically we started pulling 172 vessels out of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. Cost about $500,000 to activate these vessels. It took several weeks to activate them. You had to tow them to a shipyard. You had to get the blanks off the hull, which are welded on the side to prevent water seepage. A lot of repair work. We actually had several shipyard workers killed because of boiler explosions. and it was just not very, very efficient. And after Vietnam, the decision was made that we need to create a subset of the National Defense Reserve Fleet of ships of higher readiness that can be used by the Department of Defense at a moment's notice. Because we would always have the U.S. Merchant Marine to tap into, but they would be on worldwide shipping. They'd be involved in coastal trade. Not enough vessels would be immediately available, as we found out, to move, in the case of 1965, the 1st Cavalry Division to Vietnam. So initially, the plan was to put 30 Victory ships into the Ready Reserve Fleet, or Ready Reserve Force, excuse me. But almost immediately, there were more modern vessels in the National Defense Reserve Fleet. And over time, we've seen this fleet built up. At the eve of Desert Shield in 1990, there were 96 ships in the fleet. By the early 2000s, we were actually late 1990s, early 2000s, we were right around 116 vessels. Today, it's a lot less. We're down to 48 vessels in the fleet that makes up the Ready Reserve Force. 27 roll-on, roll-off, 8 what were fast Sealift ships. These are the old SL-7s built by Malcolm McLean in the 1970s. 6 auxiliary crane ships, 2 aviation maintenance ships, 2 heavy lifts, and a tanker. Those make up what is called the Ready Reserve Force. And then you had the 15 vessels of Military Sealift Command. These are large medium speed ro-ros. These are ships that were converted and built after Desert Storm, and some older MPS vessels, these maritime prepositioning vessels that are no longer used. 61 of these. The problem with these 61 ships is this: they're old. They're really old. Average age is about 45 years. You've got a lot of steam-powered vessels in here. Steam has gone away. You know, under IMO 20, there's almost no steam vessels sailing on the world anymore, except within navies and in this fleet. And for the past 2 years, we've seen the U.S. Transportation Command under General Lyons and the Maritime Administration, previously under Admiral Mark Busby, who had been commander of Military Sealift Command, then went on to become Maritime Administrator during the Trump administration. All of them highlighted the fact that there is a critical shortfall in surge sealift, and they identified numerous concerns. There's a March 2019 testimony by Busby and Lyons it's just, for historians, it's gold. It's these guys did not pull any punches. They sat there and said, there's a critical shortfall. We have material degrading of the fleet. We cannot sustain the mission. Add to it, if we have to sustain the fleet for more than 6 months, we do not have enough mariners. Because while we use retention crews, these small cadre crews on these vessels, there's only about 10 out of the necessary 40 to man them. We're going to have a shortfall of 1,800 mariners in the long run. Cal Maritime, my alma mater, SUNY Maritime, Merchant Marine Academy, all the other maritime schools do a great job producing third mates and third assistant engineers. What we're not producing is second mates and second assistants and chief mates and first assistants, and more importantly, masters and chief engineers. And that's where the critical shortfall comes in. And this all got tested in September of 2019. September of 2019, Transcom and MARAD had pigeoned away money to do what they call turbo activation. Now, they do turbo activations every year, where they'll activate a series of vessels, no notice activations, and they test it. But they never did anything like this. In the span of just a few days, they tested 41 vessels. It was a crazy activation. They went absolutely, they were going to activate everything. And by the time it's all done, by the end of the year, they had activated 49 out of the 61 vessels in the MARAD fleet. This was just unheard of at this time, this number of vessels to get activated. And it was meant to basically stress test the system. Both MARAD and MSC activated vessels. And it was not good. It was not good. If you read the after action report that was put together by Transcom, it holds no punches. They were supposed to have an 85% success rate. In other words, 85% of the 61 vessels should be ready. The combatant commanders, those are those geographic commanders around the world, Northcom, Southcom, CENTCOM, Indio-Pac, PACOM, AfricaCom, EURCOM, they plan on having 10 million square feet of cargo space available to them for their planning documents. 85% of that is just 8.5 million. Well, they can adjust to 8.5 million. They can make adjustments to that. This test demonstrated that only 41% of the strategic sea lift was available. That's a critical shortfall. That was a critical shortfall, and hats off to Transcom and to the Maritime Administration for not just doing this test, but for publishing the results and showing everybody how graphically we are woefully short in terms of surge sea lift. And again, this has demonstrated a big problem, that in case of a war, in case of a conflict, we will not be suitably ready to surge forces out of the United States across. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether we need 10 million square feet of cargo space. Do we need 61 vessels? Is there a more efficient way of doing this? To counter this, the Navy and Merit, I will argue, have gone back to 1990 and come up with the lessons from the Persian Gulf War. They want to build new vessels, put them in the reserve fleet, and they want to buy used vessels and replace the older vessels in here with newer vessels. I have criticisms and critiques of both of those that I can share with you later, but suffice it to say that this is a huge critical shortfall. Unfortunately for the U.S. Navy, which oversees this mission, the Sealift mission, this is low on their priorities. Understand, when they built the LMSRs, when they built 15 LMSRs, converted 5 others in the 1990s, they had to create a separate National Defense Sealift Fund to put money in so that the money could not be robbed by the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, to make sure that money was there to fund this. $6 billion to build 20 vessels, build or convert 20 vessels. They haven't done that yet. As a matter of fact, the National Defense Sealift Fund, which still exists as a line item, has 0 money in it. So, until they get serious about putting money in there to buy vessels, it'll be interesting to see, because the Navy's priority is things that shoot and go boom, whereas the Army, the Marines, the Air Force are really interested in vessels that carry cargo and get them overseas. That's why for a long time the Army was in charge of Sealift, not the Navy. That changes in 1949. So strategic Sealift, that element that's based in the United States, it's going to get the first combatant units across, is really in, I would argue, not great condition. And that brings us to the fourth side of the pyramid, which is the U.S. Merchant Marine. This is a slide I've purloined from a former Merit administrator. He used this a lot in his talks. I've updated it as much as I could here, which shows the size of the U.S. Merchant Marine in terms of ship. That's a blue line there, which peaked at 1,242 vessels during the Korean War, and is down now as of March 15th. That's the latest Merit report I was able to access, down to 180 ships, down to 180 ships. And then you see the gross tonnage, 7.2 million gross tons. Again, vessels are inherently bigger than they have been in the past. That's not a really good, accurate measure of size, because again, vessels have really gotten bigger over time. But this shows you the size of the Merchant Marine. And to put this more graphically for you, I put this slide together. These are all the vessels that make up the 180 vessels that are in the U.S. Merchant Marine with the companies they're associated with. I had to change things around here a little bit because a lot of ships are owned by sub-companies of groups, but basically put them together here for you. And this is as of 15 March 2021. Roughly around 30 companies are out there with 180 vessels out there. Everything from APL, Matson, Crowley, Maersk, American Ro-Ro carriers, Hauppauge, Lloyd, Liberty, U.S. Ocean, Sealift, Pasha, Secor, Conco, Phillips, you name it. They're all out there. These are the 180 ships that make up that fleet. These are the ones that, if you want to go out on Jones Act shipping when you graduate as a third mate or a third assistant engineer, this is where you go. I can break this down by unions too, but it gets a little confusing after a while. So I just use this one slide right here to do it. Give you an idea, the U.S. Merchant Marine is built on basically 3 legs right now, the ocean-going coastal merchant marine. One is basically cargo preference, which was recently brought up again by President Biden in his Buy America issue about making sure that American gets cargo preference. Making sure there's cargo. The only reason you have commercial vessels, to all my military friends out there, is if there's cargo. If there's no profit, there's no ships. And they will not build ships until there's cargo to put them on. And that's one of the classic issues. So that's one leg. The second leg is the Jones Act. This is the coastal trade. This is what requires U.S. flag, U.S. built, U.S. crewed, U.S. operated vessels to operate in the contiguous United States, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. You add to it the Passenger Vessel Service Act of 1886, which keeps cruise ships out from operating in the U.S. This is the big stink we got with Canada when they shut down the Alaskan trade. And then the Dredge Act of 1906, which requires dredges to be built in the United States. The Jones Act is one of those second legs. And then the third leg is those 60 ships in the Maritime Security Program. Those are those vessels that receive $5 million a year to basically be available to the U.S. government should they need them. And all this is built, I would argue, on a false premise in many ways. I argue with those who oppose the Jones Act all the time. If you don't believe me, follow me on Twitter, and you'll see a fun-filled romp with people who oppose the Jones Act versus me. And my argument, and I go back to that piece I wrote for Sea History, is the original Jones Act, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, creates a holistic national maritime security act. It creates a program that involves not just coastal vessels, but international trade. It involves building, shipbuilding. It involves everything. It involves all that. And it goes in conjunction with the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, which creates differentials or subsidies. In the 1980s and 1990s is where you see everything, or actually I'll go even further back than that, the 50s, 60s, 80s, 90s, that period post-World War II, you start seeing things change. Why does the Jones Act fleet decrease? Well, those who critique the Jones Act will tell you, well, the reason the Jones Act is so small is because the Jones Act is flawed. It makes you buy American ships, which are traditionally more expensive. And yeah, they are. But then again, those same critics who work in those think tanks are more expensive than a think tank, consultant I can get out of the Philippines or Bangladesh, for example, because they are paying American salaries. They're not paying Malaysian, Philippine, or Bangladesh salaries. The other issue you have here is things have changed. What has changed in the United States that affects the Jones Act? The interstate highway system, the interstate pipeline system, intercontinental jet aircraft, which don't move cargo as much as they move people. That gets people off railroads and opens up railroads for cargo. Now, all of a sudden, you're not moving as much freight by intercoastal because we can move it by roads. The interstate highway system, our low fuel prices, even though we pay more than we think, it's still lower than what you see in places like Europe. Very low tax rates on roads. That is more economical. I would love to be able to haul cargo from Seattle to Los Angeles by ship, but I'm not going to be able to compete with a truck driver that can do it in 27 hours, on 2 loads of fuel and deliver the cargo directly to the consumer without having to go through the port of Seattle or the port of Long Beach to move the cargo. You're never going to compete with that. Same thing in the 1980s and 1990s when the differentials went out for construction. All of a sudden, the U.S. yards didn't have international trade vessels coming in to be built, and instead they marketed to the one group in town, that was the U.S. Navy. And you saw American ships go overseas to be built, the D8s, the D9s, all these vessels that are in the international trade were being built overseas. And so in the 1990s, after Persian Gulf War, and we realized, man, we may have made a mistake, we create the Maritime Security Program. Initially 47 vessels in 1996, it expands in the early 2000s to 60 vessels. If you did not have the Jones Act, if you did not have the Maritime Security Program, if you remove, for example, the Jones Act, you remove those vessels. If you remove the Maritime Security Program, you remove those vessels. And those that are remaining almost are exclusively under U.S. government contract, operating for Military Sealift Command or the Department of State in their oil transfer programs or in grain programs under basically the cargo preference. There would be no U.S. commercial fleet. Understand, there's no U.S. commercial fleet. There's no mariners getting trained. There's no advancement going up. That means the crews for the Sealift fleet go away. That means there's not enough pool to go into the MSC fleet, which means the Navy would have to crew their vessels, which is a big problem because they just don't have the manpower to crew 60 vessels and an additional 30 others that they would need to crew. This has huge ramifications, huge ramifications. And again, what you get is not just the vessels, you get the networks that these companies make. You get that Maersk network, which again provides you an interconnectivity where you can haul military cargo to an FOB, a FOB up in Afghanistan if you need to. That's how you're getting your supplies. You got the Hauppauge Lloyd system. You got APL in the Pacific. You got U.S. Ocean, Sealift, Skylar Lines, and Liberty operating worldwide. You've got Pasha and Matson operating between the Hawaiian Islands. You've got APC and ConocoPhillips doing the Alaska trade. You've got Coastal and Trident up in Alaska doing coastal trade and doing the fisheries. And then you got the Jones Act Group, U.S. Shipping, Foss, Crawley, Secor, OSG, Tote. They're operating in and around the United States. And what we do, and I say this a lot to the maritime industry, I've got a lot of press recently talking about what's happened in the Suez. And one of the reasons I make that argument is because we do a terrible job in the maritime industry conveying what we do in the maritime industry. We are great talking to each other. We are terrible, absolutely terrible about talking to people outside the maritime industry. You know, my example is I'm writing a piece right now for Naval Institute Proceedings on the Ever Given. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is the crew of the Maersk Denver, which was the vessel just behind the Ever Given, that was able to crash stop their vessels, prevent their vessel from running into the Ever Given and running ashore. They were the second vessel right behind them. Contacted Maersk, want to talk to Maersk about it? Can't get a comment from Maersk. You know, it's a great story, American seamanship, great kind of element that we can talk about. And again, we do a terrible job of talking about it. And it's not just the present, it's the past too. Give you an idea, World War II. During World War II, the U.S. Merchant Marine lost 9,500 mariners, 733 ships, one of the highest losses of life of any of the branches of military service. At the end of World War II, the U.S. Army wrote this. This is the Army's official history of World War II. It's called the Green Book series. There are 79 volumes like this. 79 volumes, big, huge, massive volumes. 79 volumes like this. 79. Talk about the U.S. Army in World War II. The Merchant Marine got 81 pages. That's it. That's the entire history of the U.S. Merchant Marine in World War II. That's it, 81 pages. The U.S. Army got 79 volumes. The U.S. Merchant Marine got 81 pages. And I could write a page about every ship that was lost. That's 733 pages right there. I could write, you know, a paragraph about the 9,500 mariners, and I can give you books on that. And again, we get kind of lost because, again, we do a terrible job about that. Give you the last tidbit here. The Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard are great at doing these documents, these strategies, these concepts. This is the newest one, Advantage at Sea, prevailing with integrated all-domain naval power. What they do and what they fail to do consistently since they've started doing these documents is leave out the commercial aspect. They do what Andrew Lambert talked about in that first article I pointed to you about, is what's the purpose of a Navy? If your whole purpose of the Navy is to throw Tomahawk cruise missiles and Trident ballistic missiles and basically aircraft at an enemy, then we're great. You know, the U.S. Navy is #1 in the world. It's fantastic. The problem is our Merchant Marine is number 21 in the world. China's Navy is #2. Their Merchant Marine, if you add up their Merchant Marine with Hong Kong, because they basically control Hong Kong now, is #2. Who's the better sea power? Is it the U.S. with the Navy at first and the Merchant Marine at 21st, or the Chinese at second in both places? Now, Marriott has responded. They came out with this report right here, Goals and Objectives for a Stronger Maritime Nation, a report to Congress. But I would tell you, it's a poor substitute. It's a poor substitute. It's not done in any sort of really nice way. It's a clunky report. And I put it here, the objectives at the end, the way forward. They list 39 objectives. 39 objectives. That's a lot of objectives right there with 4 goals. And the goals are great. The problem is, how do you manifest those goals? How do you manifest those goals going forward? And, you know, one of the things we see right now is where we don't have a maritime administrator. We don't have anybody who's really leading the maritime industry in many ways. We have a lot of fights within the maritime industry, unions, shipyards, companies, you name it. We tend to be the best at in-person fighting. But we don't have is the advocate out there to really talk about the maritime industry. And I think that's one of the things we have to kind of improve on. Every one of you who's graduated from a maritime academy, you know, every one of you should be advocates for our industry, and you should be out there and you should have a good knowledge of the industry. You should be reading up on what's happening and be able to talk about it. And again, because I think one of the things we don't do is really articulate what the maritime industry does for the United States, does for the world, and does for the US military in many ways. And with that, I wanted to make sure I had time. I want to open myself up for questions. 2:48. I went 3 minutes long. I apologize. I'm rusty in teaching, Will. I apologize.